It began on an ordinary day, in the square where peasants haggled over turnips and cloth while priests strolled by with their noses high in the air. Amid the clamor, a man climbed onto an old barrel, his rough boots caked with mud, his tunic no finer than any farmer's. He bore no sword, no badge of office, nothing that set him apart from the crowd, except his eyes. They were sharp, burning with a fire that did not belong to a man beaten down by the world. The villagers expected a fool or a drunkard, but when he opened his mouth, his voice cut through the noise like the tolling of the church bell. "We till the fields, yet hunger gnaws at our children," he said. "We break our backs, yet our reward is little more than a master's whip, and we are told this is God's will. But I ask you, what God would bless the fat while cursing the starving?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some crossed themselves in fear, others turned away, unwilling to be seen listening. To question the order of the world was to invite punishment from both crown and church. Yet the people did not scatter. They lingered, drawn by a dangerous curiosity. And though few realized it at that moment, something had shifted. A spark had been struck, one that would not be easily snuffed out. In the days that followed, the man's words spread like wildfire carried on the wind. In the fields, bent-backed peasants repeated them in low voices while swinging their sickles. In the taverns, they were muttered between mugs of weak ale, each man glancing over his shoulder before speaking. Even in the church pews, when the priest droned about obedience, some mouths twisted in silent mockery, remembering the stranger's challenge. He had no name yet among the people, only the one who spoke, but his questions gnawed at their thoughts more than sermons ever had. Why do we hunger when the granaries of lords overflow? Why does the priest wear gold while we wear rags? Why do we bow our heads when we were born with straight spines? The rulers had not yet noticed. Kings and priests believed peasants were like cattle, dumb, obedient, incapable of rising above their station. But in the furrows of the land, something unseen had begun to grow, and the people carried the memory of a voice that dared to say aloud what they had always feared to think. The man had vanished as suddenly as he appeared, but his words remained, like seeds waiting for rain. Weeks passed, and many believed he had been only a passing madman. Yet one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he returned. This time not to the marketplace, but to the edge of the fields where the poorest labored. His face was weathered from travel, his clothes no finer than before, but his presence carried the weight of a man with purpose. The peasants gathered, cautious at first, then in growing numbers. He spoke not from a barrel now, but from the flat stone where children played when the work was done. "You bend your backs," he said, "but your strength is worth more than the crumbs you are given. You are told you are nothing, yet it is your hands that build castles and your sweat that fills the granaries. Without you, the lords starve. Without you, the priests go naked. Without you, the kings are but children with empty crowns." The words struck like thunder. Some covered their ears in terror of blasphemy. Others clenched their fists with a fire they had never dared to feel. A woman cried out that the priest would burn them all if such things were heard. But the man only looked upon her and said, "Let them try. The fire of truth burns hotter than theirs." That night, the fields buzzed with whispers louder than crickets. The people felt it, something was changing. The world, so fixed and immovable, had begun to tremble. The church was the first to take notice. On the following Sunday, Father Anselm thundered from the pulpit with a voice that rattled the rafters. He spoke not of mercy or salvation, but of rebellion and damnation. "Beware the serpent among you," he warned, sweat shining on his brow. "A man walks in shadow, whispering lies to the weak. He speaks of breaking chains, but he seeks only to drag your souls into hell. Those who lend him an ear shall burn with him in everlasting fire." The villagers shifted uneasily in their seats. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Some nodded in fear, but others glanced sideways at one another with something new in their eyes. Doubt, suspicion, not of the man who had spoken, but of the priest who trembled so violently at the thought of him. After Mass, In hushed corners of the square, the whispers grew bolder. If the stranger's words were lies, why did the priests speak with such terror? Why did the lords and holy men seem so afraid of a man with no sword, no wealth, no army? For the first time, the people sensed that their masters could be afraid. And that revelation was more dangerous than any sermon. It was in the hollow by the old mill that the people met him again, beneath the cover of night. No bells, no lords, no priests. Only the creak of crickets and the whisper of wind through the reeds. At first, they came in twos and threes, wrapped in cloaks, eyes darting like thieves. But soon there were dozens, their faces half lit by the flicker of lanterns. The man stood before them, not raised above, but among them. He did not call himself a leader. He called himself one of them. "You fear the lash of your masters," he said. "But you do not see their fear of you. They eat because you toil. They live because you bleed. Yet tell me, what power do they hold, save the power you give them?" The people stirred. Rough hands clenched into fists. Eyes glowed in the dark. For the first time, they felt not like scattered souls, but like a single body, drawn together by his words. No swords were raised, no banners unfurled. Yet in that gathering, beneath the hush of night, the first breath of a storm was taken. And though none dared say it aloud, they all knew. Nothing would ever be the same. The lords soon caught wind of the secret gatherings. Their stewards and bailiffs carried whispers to the manor, warning of peasants who spoke too boldly, who lingered too long after dark. The lord of the land, a cruel man named Sir Aldemar, sent spies to mingle among the villagers, to listen and report. The peasants knew, of course. They were not fools. They saw the unfamiliar faces at the tavern's edge, the men who asked too many questions while pretending to drink. Yet even with spies in their midst, they did not silence themselves. For every fearful mouth that stayed shut, two more opened with the courage the stranger had awakened in them. Sir Aldemar raged at the reports. "Find this man," he snarled, "and drag him before me. I will have him whipped until his tongue turns to dust." The priests urged the same, insisting he was a heretic, an enemy of God himself. But though they searched barns, hovels, and hedgerows, they never caught him. He slipped through their grasp like smoke, appearing where he pleased, vanishing when danger drew near. And with each failed attempt, his legend grew. The people began to whisper a name for him, not his true one, but one born from awe and secrecy. They called him the Voice. The Voice did not merely speak, he taught. In barns, in abandoned cottages, under the cover of night, he showed the villagers more than words could convey. He taught them to read the signs of the land, to measure grain and coin, to speak with clarity and conviction. He taught them that their hands were not only for toil, but for creating, for defending, for shaping a life that belonged to them. He did not promise gold, nor freedom granted by kings or priests. He promised something far more dangerous: knowledge. With it came power, subtle and quiet, yet more potent than any sword or decree. "Chains are not always iron," he said one night, tracing the shadows on a wall with his finger. "Chains are fear, ignorance, and silence. Break them and the rest will follow." The villagers absorbed his lessons in fear and awe. They whispered them to one another in hushed tones, testing them, practicing them, imagining a world where they were no longer cogs in another's machine. And always, always, the Voice vanished before the dawn, leaving only the echo of his words and a gathering fire in hearts that had long been cold. It happened quietly, almost unnoticed. A group of villagers, emboldened by the Voice's teachings, refused to give their grain to the Lord's steward. They loaded their wagons, not with enough to starve the manor, but enough to show that obedience was no longer automatic. When the steward came, flanked by his guards, he found not silent peasants trembling in fear, but men and women standing tall, heads high, hands steady. "We have worked for this," one of them said, a young woman with fire in her eyes. "It is ours." The guards shouted, the steward cursed, but no lash fell. The villagers did not attack, yet neither did they yield. Something in the air had shifted. The fear that once held them like a leash was gone, replaced by something raw, something unstoppable. Word of the defiance spread like wildfire. It was a small victory, yes, almost meaningless in the eyes of the lords and priests, but to the people it was proof that the world could be different, that obedience was not inevitable, that the voice's lessons were more than words. And somewhere in the shadows, he watched, a faint smile breaking across his sunburned face. It was only a matter of time before the rumors reached the king's ears. From his high hall, he listened to the tales of villages that resisted, of lords baffled, of priests trembling. The monarch, a man used to unquestioned power, did not understand how a single nameless stranger could shake the foundations of his realm. He summoned his council. "Find this man," the king demanded, voice sharp as a blade. "Bring him to me. I will see what sort of magic or madness allows him to twist peasants into rebels." Messengers rode through the countryside, scouring towns and villages. But the voice was always one step ahead. Wherever the king's men went, he had vanished, leaving only whispers and hope behind. In the villages, his legend grew. Mothers told their children about the man who could not be caught, who taught them to think, to question, to stand. Farmers who had bent for generations now held their heads higher. The voice had become more than a teacher. He was a symbol, a living spark of change that no crown, no throne, no decree could snuff out. Even the king felt it, a faint, gnawing fear that his absolute rule might not last forever. The first open confrontation came when a tax collector rode into a village known for its secret gatherings. He demanded tribute as always, expecting bows and trembling hands. Instead, the villagers met him at the edge of the square, armed only with words and courage. "Take your tribute elsewhere," a man said, voice steady. "We work for our families, not for the greedy. You have no claim here." The collector shouted, striking a peasant with his whip, but the villagers did not scatter. They pressed forward, not with weapons, but with unity, forming a wall of human resolve. The collector fled, humiliated, his horse thundering away while the people stood silent, shocked at their own daring. Word of the clash traveled fast, carried by wandering merchants and frightened clerks. The voice did not appear that day, but his presence was felt in every brave stance, every defiant glance. The people had tasted courage, and once tasted, it could not be easily forgotten. That night, fires burned brighter in the hearths, not from fear, but from hope. For the first time, the villagers believed that perhaps they could shape their own fate. The church could not abide such defiance. Priests rode into villages with banners of holy wrath, preaching fire and damnation, claiming that any who listened to the voice would rot in the afterlife. They threatened excommunication, curses, and eternal punishment, hoping fear would crush the growing courage of the people. But the more the priests railed, the more the villagers whispered. "Why do they fear him so?" they asked one another in hushed tones. "If he is evil, why does the priest tremble?" The voice did not confront the priests directly, yet his influence was stronger than any sermon. Where once men bent and women knelt, now heads lifted, eyes meeting the clerics without shame. Faith remained, but blind obedience faded. The villagers learned that the chains of fear were not divine, they were human. And so the priest's fury only spread his legend further. They painted him as a heretic, a demon. Yet the people began to see him as a guide, a teacher, a man who reminded them that life could belong to them, not the crown or altar. Change, slow and perilous, crept through the villages like roots breaking stone. By now, the voice was no longer a single whisper among villagers. Small communities began to connect, sharing news, strategies, and courage. Fields that had once been silent with fear now hummed with talk of defiance and hope. Even the children began to remember his words, repeating them like prayers, teaching them to their friends. The lords could no longer ignore it. They sent armed patrols, demanding obedience and submission. Yet every village the patrols reached seemed braver, more united than the last. Every failed attempt to break them only strengthened their resolve. And all the while, the voice remained elusive, a shadow moving among the people, teaching, guiding, inspiring. His presence was everywhere and nowhere, like the wind rustling the wheat. He had become more than a man, he was an idea. And ideas, unlike men, cannot be imprisoned or killed. It was clear to anyone paying attention. The age of unquestioned authority was beginning to crumble. Something new was rising, and it would not be easily silenced. The king, once confident in his throne, now awoke each morning to reports of villages resisting taxes, lords trembling, and priests whispering of the voice. His advisers, pale and nervous, urged him to act decisively, to crush this man before the unrest spread like wildfire. But the king could not grasp how a single man, without army, without title, could inspire such courage. Every attempt to capture the voice failed. Every village stood taller. Every peasant dared to think. For the first time in his life, the king felt powerless. In the quiet of his chamber, he whispered to no one, "Who is this man? How does he hold my people's hearts in his hands?" The fear in his voice betrayed him. It was not the fear of rebellion alone, but the fear of change. The kind of change that could topple kingdoms, erode churches, and make the crown a hollow thing. And as the king pondered, the voice moved among the people, unseen yet unstoppable, preparing them for a world that would no longer bow. It happened in a village at the edge of the forest, where the voice had gathered hundreds in secret. For the first time, the people acted openly, refusing the Lord's taxes, protecting one another against the patrols, and speaking of a future that belonged to them. The soldiers came expecting submission. Instead, they found a crowd united, their eyes fierce, their hearts unyielding. No swords were drawn at first, yet the mere courage of the villagers was enough to make the patrol hesitate. Word spread quickly. One village had stood, and the crown's authority had not moved them. The voice watched from the shadows, his figure barely visible among the trees. He did not fight, did not shout, but his presence was the anchor of their courage. That day marked the beginning of a tide that could not be stopped. Not with lords, not with priests, not even with kings. The spark he had lit now roared into flame. And the people knew it. The age of fear was ending, and the age of their own power was beginning. The voice vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving no trace but the courage he had planted. Villages continued to defy lords, priests, and kings, inspired by the memory of the man who had dared to speak the truth. The people built a new world slowly, step by step, their lives no longer entirely ruled by fear. Even the kings remembered him, muttering curses in the shadows of their halls. Priests preached against him, yet the sermons felt hollow, for the hearts of the people had shifted. And in every village, around every hearth, children repeated his words as if they were prayers, teaching one another to question, to think, to stand tall. No one knew his true name. Some said he was just a man. Others whispered that he was something more, a force of change given flesh. But everyone remembered what he had done. He showed the powerless that they were not nothing, and that even the smallest spark could ignite an age. And in that memory the world was forever changed.